When Debbie stuck her head below the water to see what was brushing against her legs, her heart froze. Huge black creatures spiraled around her and the other survivors. Sharks everywhere. They had followed the trail of blood. Sharks! Debbie screamed as they all scrambled up onto the small dinghy. But soon, two of them would make a terrible decision. A decision that would turn a bad situation into an insane horror story. Hey guys, welcome to Bent Planet, where I tell you true stories of humans in abnormal predicaments. If you love hearing incredible and disturbing tales of true human experiences, make sure you subscribe. I have plenty in store, and this one is no exception. All right, get comfortable. You ready to hear a story? Deborah Scaling Kiley gazed across the shining blue surface of the northern Atlantic Ocean, smiling as a soft warm wind wrapped around her body and filled the sails of a 58-foot yacht she had been hired to sail. Hands on the wheel, she kept telling herself that this was exactly what she lived for, perfect sailing conditions. But behind her blue eyes, something gnawed at the back of her brain. Like a little worm invading her thoughts, things just seemed off. Debbie's intuition was kicking in, but she had no idea just how insanely horrific things would become. At just 24 years old, Debbie was already an experienced sailor. She was the first American woman to have completed an around-the-world race called the Whitbread, and she figured it was probably how she got the job she was on now. A skipper named John Liphoth had called her. He had been hired by a multi-millionaire who had made his riches from the garbage industry and then bought a yacht for some fun and aptly named it the Trashman. But he didn't have the sailing skills to get the Trashman from above New York in Maine, where it was parked, right down to where he lived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, about 1,300 miles away. So he was paying John Liphoth to skipper his yacht and sail it down to him with a small crew, and Debbie was John's first choice. His first impression on Debbie couldn't have been worse though. When she first arrived at the yacht to discuss the voyage, she found him passed out, drunk, below deck. And once awake, he seemed to think every moment was a reason to celebrate life with a drink. Which can be a fun attitude on land, but Debbie had that professional voice in the back of her head saying, yeah, I hope he knows how to stay sharp and focused when it's needed, because the open ocean does not muck around. John had also invited his new girlfriend Meg Mooney on board. Meg had zero boat experience, but considering it was just a 6-day sail with forecasts of beautiful calm waters and sunshine, John obviously wanted to impress her with an amazing time. The youngest crew member was a guy called Brad Kavanagh. At 21, he'd already been through a lot, growing up with an emotionally abusive father, so the ocean was where he found some inner peace. He was a decent sailor, but Debbie was in a different league, so he was keen to get more experience working with her. Once on board, Debbie was also struck by how shabby the Trashman was. The gear was old and looked like it hadn't been serviced in forever, but John seemed unfazed, so they took off, beginning their mission together. And for the first day, it was a beautiful straight run. The sun shone, Meg sunbaked, and Debbie and the boys took turns at the wheel. John was definitely leaning too heavily into the booze, treating it like a private party. But whatever, he had his girlfriend there, and Debbie thought, it's just 6 days. Even if these guys get annoying or aren't the most professional, I'll get through it and collect a paycheck on the other side. After making it part of the way, they stopped off in Maryland to pick up another crew member, an English sailor, Mark Adams. From the moment he jumped on board though, Debbie couldn't stand his attitude. He was incredibly chauvinistic, had a huge ego, and loved to push her buttons. Actually, he loved to push everyone's buttons. But Brad seemed to think he was funny, so again Debbie thought, whatever, I can put up with some immature male bullshit for a few days while I enjoy some sweet sailing and earn some decent coin. And as it turned out, as they all pushed off, they were all feeling so pumped about the experience, everyone started to relax a bit more and get along. At least enough to enjoy the moment and feel like they were all living the dream boat life. After a glorious day, night washed over the ocean and Debbie was loving life. They were on schedule, the conditions were perfect for steering the boat, and she was in her element. So when it came time to get some sleep, she let John take over, and with a smile on her face, she drifted off. But before she was scheduled to take the next shift at the wheel, The sound of John's voice ripped Debbie away from the peaceful dream she floated in. With her eyes now wide open, she could see John bent down over her, screaming at her to get up. A storm had brewed and with almost no warning engulfed the boat. Wild winds thrashing the sails, sending loose items flying as the waves grew. And already someone was in trouble. John yelled, "Debbie, you've got to try and help Meg. She fell over and she's hurt real bad. Please take a look at her." When Debbie rushed to the deck, she couldn't believe how much the conditions had changed. Within minutes, the boat was lurching uncontrollably, arching up and over huge waves, racing down the other side of them at top speed on horrific angles that would terrify anyone not used to being on a boat. She could tell this wasn't just a small squall that would pass soon. It was a brutal storm, and its momentum was building. To make matters worse, Mark was steering the boat with one hand while the other hand gripped a bottle of spirits. And between taking huge gulps, he was throwing his head back and howling like some crazed cowboy in a bar brawl, clearly drunk out of his mind. Meg was lying down in her bed, groaning in pain from a fall, but Debbie didn't have time to console her. This was bad, and they needed to get back towards land. John agreed. He also wanted to get Meg back for a medical checkup, but there was one problem. He had forgotten to bring maps of this part of the coastline. He had no way of bringing the boat in safely without guidance. Jumping on the radio, he called the Coast Guard, who advised them of a route back in. But the moment they turned to face the coast again, the waves began smashing against the yacht with incredible force. The boat reared upwards before hurling back down insane cliffs of water. Raging winds hammered the sails until all of a sudden, as fast as lightning, material and ropes were torn from the masts, the sails disappearing into a ferocious black night. All they had now was the engine. But before they knew it, alarms started going off as the electrics began failing. Engine parts started blowing out, and before too long, the entire engine died. Now they had no engine and no sail. They were adrift on a writhing mass of liquid, being thrown in whatever direction it chose. Soon enough, the batteries would also be dead, and they wouldn't even have a radio to call for help. With this in mind, John ran back to the radio and called for an immediate rescue. Mark, who by this time was so drunk he kept switching between acting crazy and passing out, was irate about calling in a mayday, screaming that they shouldn't be giving up so easily. But John knew things were bad. Meg needed medical help, and the boat was an uncontrollable mess. The Coast Guard informed them that 2 other ships would be notified to come to the rescue. They were some distance away, but at least everyone could rest assured that help was on the way. With the storm still throwing them around like a bath toy, some sense of hope was on the horizon. And then the battery died, and all the electronics with it. Complete darkness took over. Debbie, at this point, completely exhausted and knowing there's nothing they can do but wait, lies down and tries to sleep. She can hear Mark up on deck, howling again as the waves continue to smash the boat. Next moment, they all feel themselves being lifted even higher than before as a ginormous wave snatches them up onto its crest. And as it moves out from under them, the boat free falls, twisting to its side as it drops. They all fly into the air before it connects with the ocean below. Glass windows smashing inward from the force as water floods through and into the cabins. At this point, they know the yacht is done for. Water pours into the rooms as they all race up onto the deck. Only seconds have passed by, but they feel the boat moving deeper into the water below them. Mark finally snaps out of his inebriated wolfman status and dives over to a canister that holds an inflatable life raft and emergency supplies, frantically struggling to get it open. Brad lunges towards a dinghy, pulling it free. He and Debbie slip off the boat, holding onto it, eagerly watching Mark as he finally manages to inflate the life raft. It springs into shape, air rushing in, but a fierce wind and Mark's drunken lack of coordination cause him to stumble with it. They all watch nervously as he fumbles, then loses grip of the ropes. The raft pulls away from his hands. Everyone watches in disbelief as it disappears into the darkness. Emergency rations, flares, fishing gear, a beacon device, water, food, first aid kits, everything they needed to survive was in that life raft, gone in an instant. Besides being a flotation device, the dinghy Debbie and Brad were clinging to held nothing to help them survive. John swam out to grab hold of it and they all called out for Meg to join them. The yacht was barely visible above the water by now and Meg was clinging to its rigging, too scared to let go. Debbie sees Meg frozen with fear and she knows she's going to go down with that ship. So she swims over, pulls her from the ropes, forcing her to take hold of the dinghy with everyone else. And just as she does, they all watch as the last part of the Trashman disappears below the surface of the water. That night was one of the longest any of them had ever experienced. The wind and waves were too strong for any of them to actually get into the dinghy, and beyond the water's cold temperature, the wind stinging their wet skin was pushing them all into hypothermia. Flipping the dinghy upside down, they all swam underneath it, their heads collected together inside. They pushed against each other in a bid to get some warmth. Tensions ran high though, Brad seething at John's lack of skipper skills and Mark's drunken antics. And as the night turned to day and time began wearing them all down, Meg became hysterical. She was claustrophobic and in crazy amounts of pain. When she started passing out, they flipped the dinghy back up the right way and pushed Meg up onto it out of the water. It was then that they saw how serious her wounds were. Deep cuts, almost to the bone, ran across her legs where wires on the boat had sliced through her body. Blood poured from the open wounds. Debbie knew this was a death sentence if Meg didn't get medical help as soon as possible. As the rest of them continued to grip the side of the dinghy, Debbie got increasingly frustrated, feeling Mark kicking her legs. She finally screamed at him to control his feet, but he just argued back that it wasn't him kicking her. Convinced he was being painful, she stuck her head down into the water, opened her eyes to check, and fear shot like volts through her veins. Huge black beasts spiraled around her legs, a shape nobody wants to see below them in open water. Sharks. Sharks everywhere, so many of them, darting back and forth below and around them, bumping into their feet and legs, clearly testing their prey as they prepared for an attack. "Sharks!" Debbie screamed as she scrambled up into the dinghy to join Meg, everyone else right behind her. All 5 of them screaming desperately, knowing a fateful bite was seconds away. Once on the raft, they looked back at the water as it was filled with fins. Never before had any of them seen so many sharks in one place. Now the biggest fear was for a wave to tip them back into the water where the sharks would surely rip them to pieces. So by that night they were not only exhausted and terrified, but hunger and thirst began kicking in. The rain had stopped and at one point a light appeared on the horizon, causing hope to boil up for all of them. But it evaporated just as quickly. Knowing they were impossible to see in the dark, even a rescue boat would miss them unless they were right on top of them. The light was gone as fast as it came. They all felt completely teased by fate. The only thing that didn't leave were the sharks. As daylight returned, fins continued circling, and the dehydration was getting brutal. Meg's wounds too had become horrifically infected. They were rank with staph infections. A mix of pus and other fluids oozed from ulcers and wounds, and the bottom of the dinghy began filling with a horrific liquid. As the infection slowly poisoned her bloodstream, Meg began to hallucinate and lose a sense of reality. Mark too was suffering severely from dehydration. The last thing he had had to drink before the boat sank was a bottle of scotch. So in desperation, he leaned over the side and started drinking seawater. And before long, John decided to join him, both of them taking huge gulps to appease their thirst. Drinking salt water is the worst thing to do when you're thirsty. It simply dehydrates the body more. It has twice the amount of salt the body can handle, which means the kidneys become so overwhelmed trying to get rid of it, they shut down along with other vital organs. And this causes the brain to have major delusions. Debbie and Brad watched with horror and pity. She knew that soon enough, both the men would begin losing their minds. And she was right. Before long, John and Mark's behaviour switched from exhausted to insane. Mark swore he'd just been to the convenience store to buy beer and cigarettes and accused John of stealing them, while John kept offering sandwiches to everyone that clearly didn't exist. They argued for hours with nonsensical madness to the point that Debbie felt like her mind was being pushed to the edge of sanity. And just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, John stood up in the dinghy, told everyone he was going to go and get his car, then stepped out into the water. They all yelled at him to get back in the boat, But he just said, "I can't stand this anymore. I'm going to get the car." Then turned and swam away from them, the back of his head moving slowly away, silently through the choppy water, until a scream cut through the air, a horrendous last moment of horror screeching out of John's mouth as he was attacked and pulled under the water, devoured by sharks. They all stared at the dark blue ocean as it turned a deadly red, and then silence. Silence as the dinghy continued to drift aimlessly, only broken by the sound of Meg as tears streamed down her face. But she barely had the energy to even cry. The staph infection had drained her to almost zero. As Debbie felt herself fading consciousness on the brink, she heard Mark drop deeper into delusion. He began whispering into Meg's ear, and it sounded creepy, like he was trying to seduce her, until suddenly he sat upright and stated out loud, "Right, lady, I think it's about time you and I had sex." This whipped Debbie back into reality, and she turned to Brad. "We've got to stop this. Mark needs to be stopped." But Brad could barely sit up. Meg started whimpering, and Mark responded with anger. Jumping up onto his feet, he screamed, "Fuck you, fuck you. I'm tired of playing games. I'm going back to the 7-Eleven to get some cigarettes." Brad yelled at him, "We're on a life raft." But Mark turned around, pulled himself up to the front of the dinghy, and slid over the edge, out of view, into the water. And for a brief second, there was silence. And then, bang, bang, bang! Chaos broke out below them. The boat jolted like a raft on huge rapids. Sharks were hitting the bottom of the dinghy with such force the whole thing bounced up and down. It was a frenzy, a massive feeding frenzy, as Mark was torn to pieces and devoured in less than a minute. And the sharks that had been building in masses for days got another taste of what was on that tiny boat, and they wanted more. Smashing the boat in droves, they kept trying to tip it over for what felt like an eternity. Brad and Debbie lay petrified for hours as Meg disappeared deeper into a state of delirium. As another night rolled over them, she began moaning louder and louder until it turned into a blood-curdling scream. Then, without a warning, Meg lurched up as though suddenly possessed. She shot across the dinghy onto Brad, clawing at his face in her own mad frenzy, trying to rip him to pieces as if it might relieve her own pain and desperation. Brad immediately retaliated, blocking her hands and pulling his knee up to his chest. He kicked her off. She fell onto her back and continued to moan, her hands raised in the air. Debbie and Brad watched as she began talking out loud, twisting her hands like a dancer in the air as she lay there and spurted gibberish like a Christian praying in tongues. And by the next morning, Debbie and Brad woke up to see that Meg had stopped her screaming. Her arms were no longer raised in the air. She lay quiet and lifeless. Meg was dead. After some time of shock, they eventually discussed the possibility of eating Meg's flesh to survive, but her infections had been too brutal and would definitely make them sick. So they took off her clothes for their own warmth and her jewelry to give to her family if they managed to survive, then laid her naked body on the side of the raft, both saying the Lord's Prayer and a psalm before gently pushing her into the water. They then lay down and let themselves go back to sleep, not wanting to witness the sharks tearing Meg's body to pieces. By this point, the pool of infected, foul, rancid liquid that had built up in the bottom of the small plastic dinghy was so disgusting they were both scared of its spreading infection. So Brad decided to try and pull the edge of the dinghy up at an angle so it would gather enough to scoop the liquid out. He gripped some rope that ran along the edge and pulled upwards, but being so exhausted and weak, his fingers slipped. Thrown off balance, he tumbled backwards and over the edge. He screamed out in horror, begging Debbie to help pull him back up to safety before the sharks went for the kill. But Debbie had no strength left at all. She just cried hopelessly, continuing to lie down. Brad desperately clawed at the slippery dinghy's edge. "Debbie, please help me!" But she didn't move. Finally, with adrenaline pumping through his muscles, he managed to drag himself back up and in, but then sat at the other end of the boat. He couldn't believe she hadn't even moved to help him. Anger boiled up inside him as the last two survivors were now divided. Left facing each other, with nothing, not even companionship. Debbie felt total regret immediately and begged Brad to forgive her. But Brad seemed elsewhere, lost in thought, gazing out to the horizon. "Brad, please, I'll make it up to you." She tried to get his attention back. But something had caught Brad's eye. Something on the horizon. Something he hoped to God wasn't a hallucination. It was a ship. A real ship. Almost as quickly as they'd watched the Trashman disappear, another ship appeared right beside them with real humans looking down at them, reaching down, pulling them up to safety, to salvation, to survival. It was a Russian crew. A Soviet cargo ship just happened to pass by and spot their life raft where they floated helplessly, 140 miles further out to sea from where the Trashman had sunk. As it turned out, the two ships that were initially sent to rescue them had been called back because someone had radioed the Coast Guard and told them that the Trashman yacht had made it safely back to land. To this day, it is still a mystery as to who made that call. Alright guys, that's it for today's story of humans in abnormal predicaments. If you've stuck with me to the end, please like the video and leave a comment. Stay safe out there, and until the next time, stay bent.